wisely and as a last resort. And it is a vote that says clearly to Saddam Hussein, this is your last chance. Disarm or be disarmed. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Delaware is recognized.
I seek the floor in my own right. I understand that the distinguished senator from West Virginia offered me 20 minutes of his time, but I seek the floor in my own right. And as I understand, under the President's state of affairs, I have up to 1 hour.
The senator has the balance of his 1 hour, 47 minutes.
I thank the chair. Mr. President, I will vote for the Lieberman-Warner amendment to authorize the use of military force against Iraq. And unlike my colleague from West Virginia and Maryland, I do not believe this is a rush to war. I believe it's a march to peace and security. I believe that failure to overwhelmingly support this resolution is likely to enhance the prospects that war will occur. And in line with what the distinguished lady from New York just said, I believe that passage of this with strong support is very likely to enhance the prospects that the Secretary of State will get a very strong resolution out of the Security Council. I'll vote for this because we should support compelling Iraq to make good on its obligations to the United Nations. Because while Iraq's illegal weapons of mass destruction program does not pose an imminent threat to our national security, in my view, they will if left unfettered. And because a strong vote in Congress, as I said, increases the prospect for a tough new UN resolution on weapons of mass destruction, it is likely to get weapons inspectors in, which in turn decreases the prospects of war, in my view. I might also note, and I will get into this in a moment, that my friend from Maryland and from West Virginia talked about the president being unfettered. I know of no other resolution authorizing the president to use war in this circumstance that also invokes and requires adherence to the War Powers Act, in addition to the war clause and all that ramifications that flow from that. I'm among those who had serious reservations about and flat-out straight opposition to the first draft proposed by the White House on September 19th. It was much, much too broad. The draft raised more questions than it answered. It was not clear whether the authorization requested by the President to use force was limited to Iraq or applicable to the region as a whole. It was not clear whether the objective was to compel Iraq to destroy its weapons of mass destruction programs, to liberate Kuwaiti prisoners, or to end Saddam Hussein's regime. It was not clear whether the rationale for action was to enforce the UN Security Council resolutions that Saddam has flouted for the last decade, or to implement a new doctrine of preemption. And it was not clear whether the administration considered working through the UN and working with allies important or irrelevant. The second draft, negotiated with congressional leadership, and I would say, I believe in part as a consequence of the efforts of my good friend Senator Lugar and I, and roughly 23 or 24 Republicans, got the attention of the administration. They were simultaneously negotiating with the senator from Indiana and me, as well as the leader in the House. The leader in the House reached an agreement first. I thought that was unfortunate because I believe we could have had a better resolution had that not occurred. But nonetheless, the second draft negotiated addressed some of these questions but left others unanswered. Along with many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, notably Senator Lugar, I continue to seek greater clarity about the focus of the proposed resolution. President Bush brought the resolution into sharper focus this week in his speech to the nation. He said that, quote, war is neither imminent nor inevitable. He also said that his objective was to disarm Iraq, that his rationale to enforce the United Nations resolution was not based upon preemption, and that he desired to lead the world, and if war was necessary, it would be with allies at our side. Mr. President, the resolution now before the Congress similarly is clearer and more focused than previous drafts. It is not perfect, but it acknowledged the core concerns that Senator Lugar and I and others raised, and which have been raised by such senators as Hagel and Specter and many others. Considered in the context of the President's speech this week and his address last month to the United Nations General Assembly, this resolution, though still imperfect, deserves our support, and let me explain why. First, the objective is more clearly and carefully stated. The objective is to compel Iraq to destroy its illegal weapons of mass destruction and its programs to develop and produce missiles and more of those weapons. Saddam is dangerous. The world would be a better place without him. But the reason he poses a growing danger to the United States and its allies is that he possesses chemical and biological weapons and is seeking, with his $2 billion a year illegally skimmed from the UN Fund for Food, his oil for food program, for peace program, that he is seeking nuclear weapons. And for years now, he has prevented the United Nations inspectors from uncovering those weapons and verifying Iraq's disarmament. And he is in violation of the terms he agreed to, allowing him to stay in power. What essentially happened was he sued for peace. What essentially happened was the UN resolutions were a reflection of what ordinarily, if there were no UN, would be in fact in the form of a peace agreement. This resolution authorizes the President to use force to, quote, defend the national security of the United States against the continuing threat posed by Iraq and enforce all relevant UN Security Council resolutions, end of quote. In my view, and as has been stated by the President and Secretary of State, the threat to the United States is Iraq's weapon of mass destruction programs. The relevant UN resolutions are those related to Iraqi's nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. And the fact that we use the conjunctive clause, the word and not the word or, means that the authorization we are granting to the President is tied to defending the national security of the United States in the context of enforcing the relevant UN resolutions relating to weapons of mass destruction. This is not a blank check for the use of force against Iraq for any reason. It is an authorization for the use of force, if necessary, to compel Iraq to disarm, as it promised after the Gulf War. Some in the administration have argued that our stated objective should be the end of Saddam Hussein's regime. Regime change is the ultimate goal of American policy, as embodied in the sense of the Congress provision on the Iraq Liberation Act in '98. Indeed, an effective effort to disarm Iraq could well result in regime change. After all, such an effort would force Saddam to make a hard choice, either give up his weapons or give up power, and he's made the wrong choices many times before. In his own words, the President said, taking these steps would also change the nature of the Iraqi regime itself. America hopes the regime will make that choice. But this resolution does not make Saddam's removal its explicit goal. To have done so, in my view, would run the risk of alienating other countries who do not share that goal and whose support we need to disarm Iraq and possibly to rebuild it. And it would significantly weaken our hand at the United Nations. Not at this moment. I'll be happy to yield when I finish. Nor does this resolution give the President the authorization to go to war over Bahraini prisoners, reparations owed to Kuwait, foreign MIAs, the return of Kuwaiti national advisors, or Saddam's ties to terrorism and human rights abuses. These are serious problems. The United Nations must continue to insist that they be resolved, including maintaining embargoes and tightening and strengthening those sanctions against Iraq. But I doubt seriously that the American people will support going to war to rectify any of them, nor will our allies. The Secretary of State, in testimony before the Committee on Foreign Relations, made it clear that our core objective is disarmament. And I quote the Secretary of State, "I think it is unlikely the President would use force if Iraq complied with weapons of mass destruction conditions. We all know that that is our major problem. the President is focused on, and the danger to us and to the world are weapons of mass destruction, end of quote. And this week, and by the way, I'd note parenthetically, even if my reading is incorrect, and he would be able to go to liberate Bahraini prisoners, does anybody in this body think the President of the United States would risk American forces and, in a very crass sense, his presidency by going in with American forces unilaterally to make sure that Bahraini prisoners were, in fact, released? I think that is fiction. This week, the President stated the objective clearly and concisely. He said, and I quote, "Saddam Hussein must disarm himself, or for the sake of peace, we will lead a coalition to disarm him." Mr. President, the President is right to focus on disarming Iraq and not on regime change. The second rationale is more tightly focused. It is to enforce the UN Security Council resolution on weapons of mass destruction that Saddam has defied for more than a decade. This is a man who waged a war of aggression, lost the war, and sued for peace. The terms of surrender dictated by the United Nations require him to declare and destroy his weapons of mass destruction programs. He has not done so. This resolution sets out in detail Saddam's decade of defying the Security Council's resolutions on disarmament. It states that Iraq, quote, "remains in material and unacceptable breach of its international obligations," end of quote, through its weapons of mass destruction programs. And it authorizes the President to enforce, quote, "all relevant UN Security Council resolutions regarding Iraq," end of quote, "with force if necessary." As the President said this week, America is challenging all nations to take the resolutions on the United Nations Security Council of the United Nations Security Council seriously. That's what this is about. And yet some administrative supporters have argued that using force against Iraq is justified on the basis of a new doctrine of preemption, a doctrine that could represent the most far-reaching change in our foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. In fact, the concept of preemption has long been part of our foreign policy toolkit. It's a doctrine well established under international law. What we're talking about here in this new policy is a policy of prevention, striking first at someone who may someday pose a threat to us, even if that threat is not imminent today. This policy merits a serious national debate, but not adoption by this body, nor is it contained in this resolution. The speed and stealth with which an outlaw state or terrorist could use weapons of mass destruction and the catastrophic damage they can inflict require us to consider new ways of acting, not reacting. But that is not what this is about. It would be dangerous to rush to embrace, as a new principle of American foreign policy, a rule that gives every nation the right to act preventively. The former Secretary of State, Secretary Henry Kissinger, made this point powerfully in his testimony before my committee 2 weeks ago, and I quote him, "As the most powerful nation in the world, the United States has a special unilateral capacity and indeed obligation to lead in implementing its convictions, but it also has a special obligation to justify its actions by principles that transcend the assertions of preponderance of power. It cannot be in either the American national interest or the world's interest to develop principles that grant every nation an unfettered right of preemption against its own definition of threats to its security." End of quote. Dr. Kissinger is right. What message would be declaring a policy of prevention send to the Indians and Pakistanis, the Chinese and the Taiwanese, the Israelis and the Arabs, the Russians and Chechens? This resolution does not send that message because it does not endorse the prevention doctrine. It does not need to, because the President, as he has argued, this is about compelling Saddam Hussein to make good on his requirement and obligation to disarm. Third, this resolution makes clear the President's determination to build international support for our Iraq policy. Our allies throughout the world and in the region have important contributions to make in the effort to disarm Iraq and to rebuild Iraq if we go to war. And we depend upon their continued cooperation in the unfinished war against terrorism. The United States has a singular capacity to act alone if necessary. We must, and this resolution does, preserve our right to do so. But acting alone in Iraq would cost us significantly more in lost lives, in dollars spent, and influence dissipated around the world. Acting alone must be a last resort, not a defiant retort to those not yet convinced of our policy. This resolution emphasizes the importance of international support, manifested through the United Nations Security Council. It states, the Congress of the United States supports the efforts by the President to, 1, strictly enforce through the United Nations Security Council all relevant Security Council resolutions applicable to Iraq, and encourages him in those efforts, and 2, to obtain prompt and decisive action by the Security Council to ensure that Iraq abandons its strategy of delay, evasion, and noncompliance. End of quote. Similarly, the President, in going to the United Nations over the strong objection of half his administration, made clear his desire to work with others, not around them. In his speech this week, he talked about his determination, quote, to lead the world, end of quote, in confronting the Iraqi problem. He stated that if we act militarily, we will act with allies at our side, end of quote. I'm convinced that he will follow through on this commitment. In short, the combination of this resolution and the President's own words in recent speeches, both publicly and privately, give me confidence that most of our core concerns have been addressed. I also have confidence from how far this administration has come on Iraq over the past year. Many predicted in this chamber, and many who opposed this resolution predicted, that the administration would use the terrible events of September 11th as an excuse to strike back at Iraq. This despite any credible evidence that Iraq was involved in the terrorist attacks on America. Both the New York Times and the Washington Post have reported that in the days following 9/11, the most senior Pentagon official urged the President to consider setting his sights on Iraq, not Afghanistan. And I can say from personal conversations, I know that to be true. Matter of fact, I gathered my Foreign Relations Committee staff not long after 9/11, when talk of going to Afghanistan was in this chamber and at the administration. And I suggested, based on conversations I had with some, that be careful, prepare. We're not going to Iraq. We're not going to Afghanistan. We're going to Iraq. Because I know there was a proposal that was being promoted to the President, that he should use this as an excuse to go to Iraq. Secretary Rumsfeld is reported to have argued that there would be a big buildup of forces with not that many good targets in Afghanistan. At some point, the United States would have to deal with Iraq, and is this not the opportunity he apparently suggested? Not to me, that's as reported. Many predicted the administration would ignore the United Nations and the need to build international support for its Iraqi policy. That's not surprising, because senior administrations officials said as much. During the spring and early summer, literally dozens of articles flatly stated that the President planned a unilateral attack against Iraq. As late as August 29th of this year, the New York Times reported, and I quote, officials in Washington and Crawford, Texas, are engaged in an intense debate over whether they should seek to involve the United Nations one last time. As one top advisor described the argument, Mr. Bush must decide whether to go it alone or go to the United Nations, end of quote. He went to the United Nations. Many predicted the administration would refuse to give the weapons inspector one last chance to disarm. That's not surprising. That prediction would have been made, because administrative officials consistently disparaged inspections. Richard Pearl, a senior advisor to the Pentagon, said that, quote, inspectors are not going to find anything. They will flounder if they are permitted to return, end of quote. Vice President Cheney as late as August 26th of this year, took this line, quote, "A person would be right to question any suggestion that we should just get inspectors back into Iraq and that our worries would be over. A return of inspectors would provide no assurance whatsoever of Sudan's compliance with UN resolution." I don't know how many Sunday shows I did from June through now, where every interviewer would say, "But Senator, you're wrong. The president is going to act alone." They didn't read me quote after quote from high officials. Thank God for Colin Powell. Thank God for Colin Powell, because that was the other half being argued by the administration quietly. Say, Mr. President, do not listen to those voices who counsel no inspectors and do not go back to the UN. Many predicted that the administration would not seek authorization from Congress for the use of force, and again, that's not surprising. As late as August 29th of this year, the White House Counsel told the president that he had all the authority he needs to wage war, and there was a big deal about leaking a memorandum from the White House Counsel to the world that Congress need not be involved, Mr. President. I had 2 private meetings with the president myself, where I made clear that I thought that was dead wrong, and he would be, to use the slang on the east side of my city, in a world of hurt if he attempted to do that. The president said to me personally he was going to come to Congress if he sought authority. What did he do? He came to Congress. But it's not strange that my colleagues up here would believe he would not do that. The White House press secretary actually reiterated that conclusion of White House counsel and White House briefings. Each prediction by those who thought the president would make, in my view, the wrong choice seemed very well founded, because it was based on the beliefs and statements of very senior administration officials, including the Vice President of the United States. And we all know the lore around here is that the Vice President of the United States is the most powerful man in the administration. Some even suggest it goes beyond that. But guess what? Each prediction proved to be wrong, as some of us, quite frankly, predicted all along. My colleague from New York may remember my getting a little bit of a sarcastic response in the Democratic caucuses when I suggested there was no possibility there would be a war before November. There was no possibility of an October surprise. There was no possibility that he would go and seek power to go to war if need be, absent congressional authorization. There was no possibility he'd fail to go to the United Nations. It's not just because that's the only thing I believe a rational president could do, but because he told us, told me, and I suspect many others, that that's what he would do for decades, Mr. President, President Bush did not lash out precipitously at Iraq after 9/11. He did not snub the UN or our allies. He did not dismiss new inspection regimes. He did not ignore Congress. At each pivotal moment, he has chosen a course of moderation and deliberation, and I believe he will continue to do so. At least that is my fervent hope. I wish he would turn down the rhetorical excess in some cases, because I think it undercuts the decision he ends up making. But in each case, in my view, he has made the right, rational, and calm, deliberate decision. As I noted a few moments ago, the President said this week that the use of force in Iraq is neither imminent nor inevitable, and that it makes sense because while the threat from Iraq is real and growing, its immense, its imminence and inevitability in terms of American security have been exaggerated. For 2 decades, Saddam has relentlessly pursued weapons of mass destruction. There is a broad agreement that he retains chemical and biological weapons, the means to manufacture those weapons, and modified Scud missiles, and that he is actively seeking a nuclear capability. It remains less clear how effective his delivery vehicles are, whether they be the Al-Hussein missile with a 650-kilometer range, short-range missiles, or untested and unmanned aerial vehicles. for the dispersion of chemical and biological weapons. Shifting weather conditions, the likely incineration of much of the chemical or biological agent in a warhead explosion, and the potential blowback on Iraqi forces all complicate the Iraqi use of these weapons. But we are right to be concerned that given time and a free hand, Saddam would improve this technology. Other countries have or seek weapons of mass destruction. Saddam has actually used them against his neighbors, against his own people. He has a lengthy track record of aggression, first in Iran, then Kuwait. He has brutally repressed Iraqi civilians, first the Kurds in the north, then the Shias in the south, then the Kurds again. And the combination of Saddam Hussein and weapons of mass destruction is dangerous, destabilizing, and deadly. Ultimately, either those weapons must be dislodged from Iraq or Saddam must be dislodged from power. But exactly what threat does the combination of Saddam and weapons of mass destruction pose to the United States? How urgent is the problem? Some argue the danger is threefold. First, Iraq could use these weapons against us. Two, it could use them to blackmail us. Or three, it could become a surreptitious supplier to terrorist groups. Other question these scenarios. For example, Brent Scowcroft, President George Herbert Walker Bush's National Security Advisor, now chairman of President Bush's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, recently wrote, and I quote, "Threatening to use these weapons for blackmail, much less their actual use, would open Saddam and his entire regime to a devastating response by the U.S. While Saddam is thoroughly evil, he is above all a power-hungry survivor." Similarly, Scowcroft went on to write, "There is scant evidence to tie Saddam to terrorist organizations, and even less to September 11th attacks. Indeed, Saddam's goals have little in common with the terrorists who threaten us, and he is unlikely to risk his investment in weapons of mass destruction, much less his country, by handing such weapons to terrorists who would use them for their own purposes and leave Baghdad as a return address." Daniel Benjamin, a former director of the Counterterrorism and National Security Council staff and co-author of the remarkable new book, The Age of Sacred Terror, wrote recently in the New York Times the following: "Iraq and al-Qaeda are not obvious allies. In fact, they are natural enemies. To contemporary jihadists, Saddam Hussein is another in the line of dangerous secularists, an enemy of the faith. Saddam Hussein has a long record that al-Qaeda and like-minded Islamicists Saddam Hussein has long recognized that al-Qaeda and like-minded Islamicists represent a threat to his regime. Consequently, he has shown no interest in working with them against their common enemy, the United States. Iraq has indeed sponsored terrorism in the past by always traditional ways. It sought to eliminate Iraqi opponents abroad, or when Mr. Hussein has remained true to the unwritten rules of state sponsorship of terrorism. Never get involved by a group that cannot be controlled, and never give a weapon of mass destruction to terrorists who might use them against you." And I would reiterate here, just as Mark Twain said, the reports of my death are much exaggerated, the reports of al-Qaeda in Iraq are much, 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 much exaggerated. Our own intelligence, in testimony before the Foreign Relations and Armed Services and Intelligence Committee that has been declassified, concluded that the probability of Iraq initiating an attack against the United States with weapons of mass destruction is, and I quote, low, L-O-W, low. They also have concluded that, quote, Baghdad for now appears to be drawing a line short of conducting terrorist attacks with chemical or biological weapons against the United States, end of quote. I believe it's unlikely Saddam Hussein will use weapons of mass destruction against us unless he's attacked. To do so would invite immediate annihilation, and I'm skeptical that he would become a supplier to terrorist groups. He would risk being caught in the act or having those weapons turned against him by groups who disdain Saddam as much as they despise us. And he would be giving away what is to him the ultimate source and symbol of his power, the only thing that makes him unique among the thugs in the region. Of course, Saddam has miscalculated before, and we're right to be concerned about the possibilities, however remote, that he will do it again. But we are wrong on this floor to exaggerate and suggest this is the reason and justification for going against Saddam. What I do believe that Saddam's primary goal is to dominate his region. His history, his actions, and his statements make that clear. Weapons of mass destruction are a means to that end for him, a terrible tool of intimidation that he could use to bully his people and his neighbors. During the Gulf War, the knowledge that Saddam Hussein had chemical and biological weapons did not deter us from expelling his forces from Kuwait. We gave him clear warning that using these weapons against our troops would invite a devastating response. And let me remind everybody, he did not use them. But a nuclear weapon could well change Saddam's calculus. It could give Saddam an inflated sense of his invincibility. It could lead him to conclude erroneously that he finally had the great equalizer against American power, and that he could fuel a new spasm of aggression against his neighbors or the Kurds in the mistaken belief that we would be deterred for fear that if we put anyone on the ground, they would be annihilated with his theater or tactical nuclear weapons. We cannot let Saddam Hussein get his hands on nuclear weapons. In particular, we must deny Iraq the necessary fissile material, highly enriched uranium or weapons-grade plutonium needed for a nuclear weapon. According to an unclassified letter released by the Director of Central Intelligence this week, quote, Iraq is unlikely to produce indigenously enough weapons-grade material for a deliverable nuclear weapon until the last half of this decade, end of quote. Therefore, if Iraq wants a nuclear capability sooner, it will need to turn to foreign sources for fissile material, which could shorten the timetable for an Iraqi nuclear weapon to about a year. This reality underscores the importance of U.S. and international efforts, not only to disarm Iraq, but also to reduce and better secure fissile materials in the former Soviet Union, the most logical source of black market purchases or theft. Concerning Iraq, our first step should be the one the President apparently has chosen, to get the weapons inspectors back into Iraq. There is disagreement about the value of weapons inspectors. Skeptics contend that inspectors can never guarantee the complete disarmament of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, particularly our Vice President, especially given the prevalence of dual-use materials and mobile facilities for the production of chemical and biological weapons. Proponents believe that inspectors heighten the barrier to development and production of WMD and will buy time until the regime change in Iraq occurs. They point to the success of UNSCOM and IAEA. For example, the British white paper on Iraq's WMD issued last month, which was quoted by those who wish to move against Iraq, says, and I quote, despite the conduct of the Iraqi authorities toward them, both UNSCOM and IAEA action teams have valuable records of achievement in discovering and exposing Iraqis' biological weapons programs and in destroying very large quantities of chemical weapon stocks and missiles, as well as the infrastructure for Iraqi's nuclear weapons program, end of quote. It has been argued that UNSCOM's most notable achievements were the result of fortuitous defections. In fact, much of UNSCOM's success was due to diligent detective work in Iraq. But let's assume that defections and not detection are the key to success. Isn't the best way to encourage defections? Isn't the best way to get first-hand information about Iraqi weapons programs to have inspectors back on the ground talking to the key people? I agree with President Bush that given a new mandate and the authority to go any place, any time, with no advance warning, UN inspectors can work. They can succeed in discovering and destroying much of Saddam's chemical and biological arsenals and his missile program. They can delay and derail his efforts to acquire nuclear weapons. And at the very least, they will give us a clearer picture of what Saddam has. Force him to focus on hiding his weapons and not building more, and buy us time to build a strong international coalition to act if he refuses to disarm. Mr. President, there is no question that with regard to Iraq, we have a real and growing problem. But I also believe that we have time to deal with that problem in a way that isolates Saddam and does not isolate the United States of America. Isolates Saddam, not the United States of America. And that makes the use of force the final option, not the first one, that produces the desired results, not unintended consequences. That is the course President Bush has chosen, in my view. Now it is incumbent upon the United Nations and the United States Congress to help him stay the course. The United Nations Security Council must deliver a tough new resolution that gives the weapons inspectors the authority they need to get the job done. As the President put it, the inspectors, quote, must have access to any site at any time, without preconditions, without delay, and without exceptions. Mr. President, the resolution should set clear deadlines for compliance, and it should make clear the consequences if Saddam Hussein fails to disarm, including authorizing willing UN members to use force to compel compliance. I also agree with the President that the key component of any inspection regimes must be the UN's ability to interview those with knowledge of Iraq's weapons programs in a climate free of fear and intimidation, including being able to take them outside of Iraq. Offering sanctuary to those who tell the truth would also deprive Saddam Hussein of their expertise. To that end, this week, Senator Specter and I introduced legislation called the Iraqi Scientist Liberation Act that would admit to our country those Iraqi scientists, up to 500, those Iraqi scientists, engineers, and technicians, and their families who give reliable information on Saddam's programs to us, to the United Nations, or to the Atomic Energy Agency. It is also critical that Congress send the right message to the United Nations Security Councils. Its members must not doubt our determination to deal with the problems posed by Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, including our willingness to use force if necessary. The stronger the vote in favor of this resolution, the stronger the likelihood, in my view, that the Security Council will approve a tough UN resolution. That's because the UN will conclude, if we don't act, America will, so we better. And a tougher UN resolution, the less likely it is that we'll have to use force in Iraq. That's because such a resolution would finally force Saddam to face the choice between inspectors and invaders, between giving up his weapons and giving up power. And there's at least a chance that he might make the right choice. But there's also a chance that Saddam will once again miscalculate, that he will misjudge our resolve, and in that event, we must be prepared to use force with others if we can, and alone if we must. And the American people must be prepared. They must be prepared for the possible consequences of military action. They must be prepared for the cost of rebuilding Iraq, as the President said he is committed to do. They must be prepared for the trade-offs that may be asked of them between competing priorities. They must be prepared for all these things and more, because no matter how well conceived, no matter how well thought out a foreign policy, it cannot be sustained without the informed consent of the American people. If it comes to that, if it comes to war, I fully expect the President will come back to the American people and tell us what is expected of us. As a matter of fact, Mr. President, when he met with the congressional leadership and committee chairs about 10, 15 days ago, I forget the exact date, we were all around the cabinet table. And at one point he turned to me and he said, "Mr. Chairman, what do you think?" And I said, "Mr. President, I'll be with you if you make an earnest effort to go through the United Nations, You try to do this with our allies and friends if, in fact, the UN does not support our effort, like we did in Kosovo, and if you're willing to be square with the American people, Mr. President, of what sacrifices we're going to ask of them, particularly the need to have significant number of American forces in place in Iraq after Saddam Hussein is taken down. And in the presence of all my colleagues at that meeting, he said, I will do that. He has never broken his word. So, Mr. President, he's made two very important speeches so far. One to the UN and one to the American people about the danger of Saddam Hussein. But no one yet has told the people of Georgia, the people of Delaware, the people of this country what we will be asking of them, because it will be profound. It may be necessary, but it will be profound. As I said, if it comes to war, the President, I am confident, will go to the American people. In a speech last week, he made a compelling case that Iraq's failure to disarm is our problem as well as the world's. But as I said, he has not yet made the case to the American people that the United States may have to solve this problem alone or with relatively few people. Or has he told us of the sacrifices that such a course of action will involve? I'm confident that he will do so if and when it proves necessary. But I also want to be clear here today, Mr. President, about the issues the President must address before committing our armed forces to combat in Iraq as a moral obligation to level with our people. First, the consequences of military action. Attacking Iraq could and probably will go smoothly. We have the finest fighting force in the world. Our defense budget exceeds that of the next 15 countries combined. According to expert testimony my committee received this summer, Iraq's conventional forces are significantly weaker than they were during the Gulf. And as a leading expert in the Middle East, Mr. Ajami told the committee, there is a strong likelihood that Iraqis would welcome us as liberators. But while it would be reasonable to expect the best, it would be foolhardy not to prepare for the worst. There is a danger in assuming that attacking Iraq will be, as some suggest, a cakewalk. We should all heed the powerful words of military analyst Anthony Cordesman, who testified before the Foreign Relations Committee in July. And here's what he said to my committee. I think it's incredibly dangerous to be dismissive of the difficulty. It's very easy to send people home unused and alive. It's costly to send them home in body bags because we did not have a sufficient force when we engaged. And to be careless about this war to me would be a disaster. This is not a game. It is not something to be decided from an armchair, end of quote. There is a danger in attacking Iraq. There's a danger that attacking Iraq could precipitate what we were trying to prevent, Saddam's use of weapons of mass destruction against our troops. My friend from Georgia who's presiding is a military man. He's a former Marine, and he's a tough guy, and he's level-headed and straight. He might be interested that last Sunday, as I came down to the memorial for firefighters, he knows I commute every day, and I never come to Washington on Sunday. But there was a tribute to fallen firefighters, which occurs every year, and I was asked to speak. As I got off the train, I ran into a four-star, I don't want to identify him too closely, a four-star general in one of our branches who held a very high position very recently and still holds a very high position. And I asked him what he thought about this war possibility. And he said he did not like it. He said two things to me, and I say this to an ex-Marine sitting up there. He said, there's two things that will be fundamentally different than ever before. We have never gone to war in an environment that could possibly be totally contaminated before we get there. And number two, we have never gone house to house in a city of 4 million people. 4 million people. Mr. President, this all may work perfectly well. This all may go just so nicely. But to imply to the American people that that's a surety would be immoral disingenuous, and would reap the whirlwind if it does not occur. The American people are tough. They will do what they think is necessary for our security, and they will make sacrifices. But I will be no part, if we go to war, of providing pablum to them that somehow this is going to be overwhelmingly likely an easy undertaking. If you notice, everybody says here the American people support this war. That's not true. They support this war if it's a 100-hour war like the last war was. They don't support the president's ability to go to war unilaterally. If you look at all the polling data, what they support is if we go with our allies in response to a genuine threat, which I think exists, and if it is not going to be costly in terms of the loss of human life, American soldiers, then they overwhelmingly support it. Over half still support it, even if there is loss of life. But hardly anyone supports it if it's alone, if they're not told, if there's a significant loss of life. As CIA Director George Tenet stated in a letter to Senator Graham just this week, and I quote, "Should Saddam conclude that a U.S.-led attack could no longer be deterred, he probably," let me say that again, "he probably would become much less constrained in adopting terrorist actions. Such terrorists might involve chemical and biological weapons. Terrorism might involve chemical and biological weapons. Saddam might decide that the extreme step of assisting Islamist terrorists in conducting a WMD attack against the United States would be his best chance to exact vengeance, taking a large number of victims with him," end of quote. There's a danger that Saddam would seek to spark a wider war. I just did one of the shows we all do with Charlie Rose. He quoted to me what I knew privately from my discussions with him. The former commander of CENTCOM testifying that he saw no need to go into Iraq now, and the cost would be high. There is a danger that Saddam would seek to spark a wider war. Many experts have expressed concern to my committee that if attacked, Saddam Hussein would lash out at Israel. Last month, the New York Times reported that Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon told senior administration officials that Israel would strike back if Iraq attacks Israel. Then, key Arab countries could come under tremendous pressure to break with us and confront Israel. It would be wrong for us to tell Israel that they should or should not do what they should or should not do in their self-defense, but it would also be wrong to ignore the risk that a war against Saddam Hussein will ignite a much larger conflagration. There is a danger that Saddam's downfall could lead to widespread civil unrest and reprisals. There's only one thing I disagreed with the president's speech on Monday. He said, "What could be worse than Saddam?" I can tell you a lot that could be worse. Mr. President, a parliamentary inquiry. Although I have the floor of my time, my recollection is the senator from Virginia gave me 20 minutes of his time. And I would ask unanimous consent that I'm able to proceed on the Senator from West Virginia's grant of time to me.
Without objection.
I will not take all that time. Mr. President, as I said, there's a danger that Saddam's downfall could lead to a widespread civil unrest and reprisals. Chaos could invite the Kurds to seize valuable and viable oil fields, the Turks to cross the border in an effort to prevent a Kurdish state from arising, and Iran and even Syria to move in to fill a vacuum. No one of these scenarios is inevitable, but no one should be used, and none should be used as an excuse for inaction. But each must figure into our planning and in the minds of the American people if we ultimately use force against Iraq. We must be honest with the American people. In his speech this week, the President made it clear that if military action is necessary, the United States and our allies will help the Iraqi people rebuild their economy and create the institutions of liberty in a unified Iraq at peace with its neighbors, end of quote. Let me repeat that again. This is what the President said. The United States and our allies will help the Iraqi people rebuild their economy and create the institutions of liberty in a unified Iraq at peace with its neighbors, end of quote. Mr. President, this is a much more complicated country than Afghanistan. Mr. President, we have not done it in Afghanistan. Mr. President, we have not even kept our commitment in Afghanistan yet. So, Mr. President, we are taking on a big deal here. We may need to do it. I know the President, presiding officer, and my colleague from Ohio and my colleague from Vermont on the floor here know that Iraq is an artificially constructed nation. When has there been a circumstance in Iraq when there's been anything remotely approaching a democratic republic? I cannot think of it in the history of the Iraq as defined now. The Kurds are Indo-European Sunnis. The Sunnis are Arab Sunnis. The Shias that make up 60% of the population, primarily living between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, they are Shias who have been at war with the Sunnis. The Iranians are Shia. There are 600,000 Iraqi Shia in Iran. Mr. President, this is complicated stuff. But to listen to some of my colleagues on the floor who blithely blow this off like, no problem, take down Saddam, there's a James Madison waiting to step into the vacuum, we'll have a democratic republic, it will set a new tone and tenor for all, as the Vice President said, for all of the Middle East, because we'll have a new democracy there. Mr. President, that is a big deal. A big undertaking. Why did the President say this, though? Well, this is a critical commitment, one I wholeheartedly endorse, but it's not done out of altruism, but out of a hard-boiled calculation that in Iraq, we cannot afford to trade a despot for chaos. No, but none of this will be cost-free. It's going to require a significant investment of military, financial, and human resources. Let's start with the cost of war. Last month, the White House economic advisor, Lawrence Lindsay, estimated the cost of a military campaign in Iraq at between $100 and $200 billion. Now, my friends on the floor here, we all are economic conservatives. Where are we going to get the money? I say to my friends, as I said in the committee, those of us who want to see a national health insurance policy, forget it for a while. Those of us on this floor who want to make permanent the president tax cut, forget it for a while. As they say in parts of my state, we ain't got the money. Doesn't mean we shouldn't move on Iraq, but it means we should be honest with the American people. Honest with them and tell them what the estimated cost of this own administration is. By the way, that estimated cost reflects the same that the Congressional Budget Office suggested. The higher cost estimates result from a lengthy campaign and external factors such as a spike in oil prices if that occurs. And that's just to win the war, Mr. President. The cost of securing the peace could be significantly higher and could extend years in the future. On the other hand, maybe we'll end up with an Iraqi government to take place. There's plenty of money in Iraq. They can fund their own reconstruction, and that may happen. And I may not be facetious, but it is not anywhere near certain. I say could because there are those who believe that our commitment to Iraq the day after need not involve exorbitant expenditures. Former Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger told my committee in August, and Secretary Rumsfeld repeated it last month, that the U.S. would not have to stay too long in Iraq. They and others argue that Iraq has a talented population, considerable resources to pay for its own reconstruction. The problem is, 1/3 of that talented population hates the other 2/3 of the talented population. They say Iraq will quickly be able to organize itself politically, economically, and militarily into a peaceful, unified nation free of weapons of mass destruction. But the American people need to know that most experts believe that Iraq will require considerable assistance politically, militarily, and economically. Indeed, they say we should speak not of the day after, but of the decade after. My committee heard testimony in July from military experts in post-conflict reconstruction, the fellow who headed up that department in the Pentagon, post-conflict reconstruction, who stated that 75,000 troops would be required at a cost of $16 billion for just the first year to maintain order, preserve Iraqi's integrity, secure its weapons of mass destruction sites. Just to do that. Just to do that. Other experts predict the United States will have to engage substantial resources in Iraq, which has no history of democracy, for many more years. So, Mr. President, when my cowboy friends say, you know, why do we need anybody? Let's go get them. I don't want all 75,000 of those forces being American. Anybody happen to notice recently that in Kuwait, American military personnel are being picked off? Anybody happen to notice that? Anybody happen to notice that the targets in Iraq, in Afghanistan? Where have we been? The American people need to know what the experts know, and we have an obligation, and the President has an obligation to tell them if the need arises. In a recent study in the Atlantic Monthly, James Fallows summed up the significant challenges that Iraqis will not be able to handle on their own. And I think this is overwhelmingly agreed upon by left, right, and center. He says they will not be able on their own to handle the following: cleaning up the after effects of battle and any malicious destruction Saddam may create with his chemical and biological weapons or by sabotaging his own oil fields. They'll need help to do that. Providing basic humanitarian needs in the short term, such as food, water, and medical care. 3, dealing with refugees and displaced persons. I told you there's 700,000 Shia in Iran. I mean, I know you knew that, but I remind you there's 700,000 in Iran. Catching Saddam Hussein if he tries to flee. We're still looking for Osama bin Laden. We're still looking for, Omar, the tent maker. We're still looking. We're still looking for these guys. We don't have them yet. Providing police protection and preventing reprisal killings. Denazification of the Ba'athist officials and security services. Aiding in the formation of a new government. Ensuring Iraqi territorial integrity and dealing with possible Iranian and Turkish intervention. Rebuilding the oil industry while ensuring a smooth re-entry of Iraqi oil into the world market. They are a finite list of what everyone acknowledges no new government in Iraq could do quickly. Those who argue most vigorously that a post-Saddam Iraq can serve as a model and source of inspiration for democracy in the region and throughout the Muslim world must be prepared to back a massive long-term American commitment. To set that objective, but then to believe it can be done on the cheap, is a recipe for failure. Let me quote from Mr. Gingrich. Mr. Gingrich, this is a news report in the New York Times. It said, the advisors, who include House Speaker Gingrich and Mr. Pearl, argued that the White House should create a high-level interagency group to coordinate the military and reconstruction planning before an invasion takes place. That sort of powerful council could overcome the bureaucratic and philosophic divisions that have hindered reconstruction planning, the advisors contend. Quote, it was a mistake we made in Afghanistan, said Mr. Gingrich, who sits on the Defense Policy Board. Quote, you shouldn't go into a country militarily without having thought through what it should look like afterwards, end of quote. The mere fact these men who are on the board are saying we should do this is evidence it's not been done yet. And we must be clear with the American people that we are committing to Iraq for the long haul, not just the day after, but the decade after. And finally, let's consider the possible trade-offs here. The President has argued that confronting Iraq would not detract from the unfinished war against terrorism. I believe he is right. We should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. But if military action occurs and comes, it will take a Herculean effort for senior leaders of our government to stay focused on two major undertakings at once. War is intense. It often produces unintended consequences. A new front against Iraq must not distract us from the job number one, taking down al-Qaeda. And let's also be clear that this could involve sacrifices. For example, the war on terrorism is putting intense demands on Navy SEALs, Army Green Berets, Delta Commandos, Air Force ground controllers, and Arabic linguists. Units have been deployed in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Georgia, Yemen, Africa, and the Philippines. And last month, the commander of U.S. Special Operations Forces requested an additional $23 billion over the next 5 years to prosecute the war against al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, not Iraq. Our intelligence service have also redirected resources to the war on terrorism. How are we going to pay for all this? Can we take on Iraq, prosecute the war on terrorism, maintain the president's tax cut for the wealthiest Americans? Can we afford to repeal the estate tax for the top 2% of the population who pay it? What would be the national health insurance and prescription drug prospects and benefits in the near term? The point is, we will do what we have to do to protect our national security, but let's not kid ourselves that it can come down to cost-free, without trade-offs, and without setting priorities. Setting priorities and making hard choices is what governing is all about. So is being forthright with the American people about what's expected of them. We should not be afraid to ask our fellow Americans to sacrifice for vital cause if we conclude we should go to war. Generation after generation of Americans has done so willingly, and will do it again if that's what they're called upon to do, but we must be straight with them. In conclusion, Mr. President, few resolutions that come before the Congress are as grave and consequential as the one before us today. We've heard powerful arguments on both sides of the resolution and concerning the various amendments that have been presented, and that's how it should be. We've come a long way during the last year. An administration that many thought would ignore the United Nations, ignore the United States Congress, has and is seeking the support of both. We've come a long way in 3 weeks, a long way since the White House first offered its draft resolution. This resolution, resolution and the President's words make it clear that the administration's objective is to disarm Iraq, and that the rationale to enforce Iraqi's obligations to the United Nations is the reason we would go, and that its determination is to work with others, not alone. The President has made it clear that war is neither imminent or inevitable. And I am confident, Mr. President, the reason why the President, thankfully disregarding the advice of some in administration, understands the significant need for others to support us is that fighting two wars, a war in Iraq and a war against terrorism, can be greatly assisted the more the world is with us. We do not need them if it comes to that, but the cost we will pay will be significantly higher. I compliment the President for recognizing that, and I am absolutely confident the President will not take us to war alone. I am absolutely confident that we'll enhance his ability to be able to get the world to be with us by us voting for this resolution. And I'm absolutely confident if it comes time and need to go to war with others or alone, the President will keep his commitment to make the third most important speech in his life, to come to the American people and tell them what is expected of them, what is being asked of them. To do any less would be to repeat the sins of Vietnam. And the sin of Vietnam, no matter what our view on Vietnam was not whether we went or didn't go. But the sin, in my view, was failure of two presidents to level with the American people of what the cost would be, what the continued involvement would require, and what was being asked of them. We cannot, must not, and if I have anything to do with it, we will not do that again. I thank the Chair for his consideration and his patience. I yield the floor.